What would you do if your father left $40 million but gave every single cent to your brother? Imagine standing in a glittering $2 million wedding surrounded by the rich and powerful, knowing you've been erased from your own family's legacy. But what if you held the one secret that could destroy it all? Stay with me, because this isn't just a story of betrayal. It's about truth, power, and the revenge they never saw coming. I still remember the way the autumn wind felt that morning, cold and sharp against my skin, as if it wanted to slice through the numbness I was carrying. The long driveway leading up to the Hamptons estate was lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, each one a reminder of how much my father cared about appearances. Thomas Carter had built this place from the ground up, both the house and the empire that came with it. Standing at the edge of the grand marble foyer, I felt small, like I was 10 years old again, waiting for his approval that never fully came. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne. Men in dark tailored suits whispered to each other, while women in sleek black dresses clutched their designer handbags and dabbed at their eyes with linen handkerchiefs. They were here for the spectacle of a great man's farewell, not for the man himself. The room was filled with people who owed my father something, or who gained something by showing up. I moved quietly past the guests toward the main hall, where his casket sat under a massive chandelier that cast cold, fragmented light across the polished wood floor. His face looked peaceful, almost too peaceful for a man who had been so demanding, so precise, so relentlessly in control. For a brief moment, I wanted to believe he was just resting, that he would wake up and tell me to stop looking so serious, to fix my posture, to smile more. But reality pushed through like a splinter. Behind me, I heard a soft murmur. I turned and saw my brother. Ethan Carter walked in like he owned the room. He always had that presence, the kind that made people turn and pay attention even when they didn't want to. He was dressed impeccably, a perfectly fitted black suit, a silk tie, and that familiar smug look etched into his face. And of course, Victoria Hayes was with him. She floated beside him like a shadow dipped in honey, her black dress clinging to her frame in a way that made the women in the room glance twice. Her hand rested lightly on Ethan's arm, her lips painted in a soft nude that matched the polished diamond earrings glinting under the chandelier. I froze. Seeing them together was like swallowing ice. Victoria gave me a look something between sympathy and calculation, and then turned back to whisper something in Ethan's ear. He smirked just enough for me to notice. Linda Carter. My mother stood near the casket with her hands folded in front of her. She looked pale, thinner than I remembered, as if the weight of the past few weeks had pressed the life out of her. When her eyes met mine, she tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She glanced away almost immediately back to the casket. It was as if she couldn't bear to hold my gaze, and I felt a familiar sting in my chest. I walked toward her slowly, the sound of my heels soft against the floor. For a moment it felt like the two of us were the only ones there. I reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. She didn't look at me, just kept staring straight ahead. "Mom," I said quietly, "you're shaking." She nodded slightly, but didn't answer. I could feel how cold her fingers were. Before I could say more, someone else stepped closer. Olivia. The voice was calm, low, familiar. I turned and saw Marcus Reynolds standing a few feet away. He was dressed like everyone else, but there was something different in his presence. He didn't look like the others who were here for appearances. He looked conflicted. His dark brown hair was neatly combed back, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes gave him away. "Marcus," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He gave a small nod, his gaze flicking toward Ethan, who was now shaking hands with a group of guests. Then he looked back at me, his lips pressing together as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. His hand tightened around the folder he was holding. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone carrying a weight I couldn't place. "I'm fine," I answered, though we both knew it was a lie. Marcus hesitated, his eyes searching mine for a second too long. Then he stepped back and glanced around the room as if to make sure no one was watching him. His mouth opened slightly like he was about to tell me something, but then he stopped. "What is it?" I asked. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. "It's not the right time," he murmured. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Not the right time. For what? Before I could push further, Ethan's voice boomed across the hall light, and charming the way he always sounded when he wanted to play the perfect son. He was telling a story about our father to a cluster of guests, embellishing details to make himself look like the devoted child. The crowd laughed softly, nodding in approval. I glanced at Marcus again, but he had already stepped back into the shadows, his jaw tense. My mother shifted next to me, her eyes still fixed on the casket, unblinking. The room suddenly felt smaller, tighter, like it was closing in around me. I took a slow breath and turned away, needing air. As I walked toward the French doors that opened onto the terrace, I caught Victoria's eyes from across the room. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that wasn't warm, wasn't kind. It was the smile of someone who knew something you didn't. Outside, the breeze hit my face, and I gripped the railing, staring out over the manicured lawn. I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. My father was gone. My mother was silent. My brother was performing for the world. And Marcus knew something he wasn't telling me. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady myself, but all I felt was the growing sense that whatever came next was going to change everything I thought I knew. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of sterile scent that only law offices in Manhattan seemed to have. I sat in one of the high-backed leather chairs, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as I stared at the folder in front of Marcus Reynolds. It was mid-December, and outside the window, I could see snowflakes falling slowly, coating the sidewalks and taxi roofs in white. Inside, though, it was warm, too warm, as if the room was designed to make you sweat no matter how calm you tried to look. Marcus stood at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral. He was holding the official copy of Thomas Carter's will, the document that would determine what was left of my father's legacy. Across from me sat Ethan, perfectly composed, in a charcoal suit and silk tie. Victoria Hayes sat beside him, her legs crossed elegantly, one manicured hand resting on Ethan's arm, like she already belonged to the empire that hadn't even been spoken about yet. Linda, my mother, was next to me. She kept her eyes lowered, focused on a spot on the mahogany table as if it would give her strength. And at the far end sat Henry Dawson, the interim CEO of Carter & Sons, his silver hair combed back neatly, his lined face impossible to read. Marcus cleared his throat softly. His voice was calm, but it carried weight as it filled the room. "We are here today to officially read and record the last will and testament of Thomas Carter, dated September 2023. I held my breath without meaning to. Marcus continued, his tone steady. "In this will Thomas Carter leaves all shares, assets, and holdings of Carter & Sons, as well as all personal investments, accounts, and properties valued at $40 million to his son, Ethan Carter." The words rang in my ears. My stomach twisted. My chest felt tight. I waited for the next line, the part where my name would be mentioned. He did not say it. Marcus kept reading, detailing minor charitable donations provisions for the staff at the Hamptons estate, and then stopped. He closed the document gently, his eyes flicking up for a brief second, before looking down again. "That concludes the reading." I blinked. For a moment I thought I had misheard. I felt heat rising in my face, a dizzying wave of disbelief crashing into me. "What about me, Marcus?" My voice was quiet, but it sliced through the silence. He hesitated. His hand tightened slightly on the edge of the folder. "Olivia, this is what your father—" I cut him off. "No. Read it again." Marcus looked at me with something like pity, but didn't move. Next to me, my mother finally raised her eyes. She didn't say a word. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak, but then she closed them again. Across the table, Ethan leaned back in his chair, a small calculated smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. "I am sorry," Olivia, Marcus said softly. "There is no provision in this will for you." The room spun for a second. I gripped the edge of the table to keep myself steady. "You cannot be serious." Ethan's voice cut through like a blade, smooth and cold. Maybe you should not act so surprised. I turned to him slowly. What did you do? He shrugged lightly, his eyes glinting. Nothing you wouldn't have done if you were in my place. You are lying. He tilted his head slightly, pretending to look concerned. Olivia, you always thought you were the favorite. Maybe you were wrong. My hands trembled as I stared at him. For years, I had carried the quiet certainty that despite everything, despite the arguments, despite being pushed out of the company, my father still believed in me. That he would never leave me with nothing. And now I was being told in a cold Manhattan law office that I didn't even exist in his final words. Victoria shifted in her seat. Her expression was carefully composed, but I saw the tiniest flicker in her eyes when she glanced at Marcus. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Marcus avoided my gaze. His lips pressed into a thin line as he gathered the documents into a neat stack. I could see the tension in the way his shoulders moved, the way his breath caught slightly before he exhaled. Henry Dawson remained silent, his face unreadable. He simply adjusted his cufflinks and stared down at the table like this was just another business meeting. I stood up suddenly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. This isn't over. Ethan leaned back further, his hands folded in his lap. His tone was soft but laced with venom. You never could accept reality, could you, Liv? I felt my mother's hand on my arm, weak, trembling. Olivia, please. I pulled away gently and looked at her. She couldn't meet my eyes. Marcus finally glanced up at me. For a split second, I saw something there. Guilt. Maybe even regret. Ethan rose from his seat, slowly buttoning his jacket. Come on, Victoria. We have a lunch reservation. Victoria stood, her movements graceful. She didn't look at me as she followed him out. The room felt colder once they were gone. I turned to Marcus again. There is something you are not telling me. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His jaw tightened. It's complicated, he said quietly. What does that mean, Marcus? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen, and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He stepped aside, lowered his voice, but I could still hear the name he spoke. William. I froze. William Hayes. Victoria's father. Yes, Marcus said into the phone. It has been read. Everything is handled. He paused, his back to me now. I understand. I will keep it that way. My chest tightened. I didn't know all the pieces yet, but I knew enough to realize this was not just my father's will. It was a performance, a game one I hadn't even been invited to play. Marcus ended the call and turned back toward me. His face was neutral again, too neutral. I have another appointment, Olivia. We will talk later. I stared at him. The man I once trusted, the man who had been my friend, my confidant, wouldn't even look me in the eye. Fine. I grabbed my coat from the back of the chair and walked out of the room, my heels clicking against the marble hallway. The cold air hit me the moment I stepped outside, sharp enough to steal my breath for a second. I stood on the sidewalk, the noise of Manhattan buzzing faintly around me, and tried to steady myself. The city felt different now, harsher, less familiar. I could feel the weight of something bigger pressing down something I couldn't yet name. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. The cab ride back to my apartment in Brooklyn felt longer than usual. The snow had turned into a thin drizzle, streaking the car window with trails of gray. I stared out without really seeing the streets, my mind replaying the scene in the law office, over and over. My father's voice in my memory sounded distant, almost hollow, as if he were still trying to say something I could not hear. When I finally stepped into my apartment, the warmth didn't comfort me. It only made the silence feel heavier. I slipped off my coat and sat on the edge of the couch, my hands resting in my lap. My eyes wandered to the framed photos on the shelf. There was one of me at a company event back in 2018, smiling next to a model of a new building Carter & Sons had been contracted to design. Back then, I still believed I had a future in the family business. I still believed Ethan was simply reckless, not malicious. The memory surfaced slowly but vividly. It was the summer of 2018. I had been leading one of the biggest development projects the company had taken on in years, a sustainable housing complex in Seattle that was supposed to be our flagship for a new era of construction. Ethan was supposed to oversee the finances, but he was distracted spending money on flashy investments and side ventures. I should have seen it coming. I remembered the day Thomas called me into his office. His face was set in stone, his voice tight. "There is a shortfall of $2 million in the project's budget, Olivia. Do you know how this looks?" I had blinked in shock. I checked those numbers twice. There should not be any shortfall. He had handed me a folder. The documents inside showed unauthorized withdrawals, missing invoices. Ethan was listed as the approver, but when I looked closer, there were fake signatures. My name. I never signed these. I remember my voice shaking. Thomas's eyes hardened. "You were in charge of this project. You should have caught this." I tried to explain. I told him Ethan had been handling the funding. I told him I would find out what happened. But the damage was already done. Ethan had gone to him first. He had framed it as my incompetence saying I let things slide, saying I was distracted. And Marcus. Marcus was there for me at first. He believed me. He stayed late nights at the office, helping me sift through financial reports looking for proof that I wasn't at fault. But then whispers started circulating. Rumors that Marcus had been getting close to me because he wanted leverage, that he wanted to secure a better position by staying connected to the Carter family. I still remembered the way Marcus had looked at me when I confronted him about the rumors. His expression was wounded but restrained. "You think I am using you?" I had been too hurt, too raw to answer properly. I just stared at him, unsure of who to trust anymore. In the end, I stepped down from the project. Thomas didn't fire me outright, but he suggested I take an extended leave. He said it would be better for the company's image. From that point on, Ethan was the one who attended the board meetings, who sat at Thomas's right hand. I was pushed aside slowly but effectively. I came back to the present and felt a sharp ache in my chest. That was the moment everything shifted. From then on, Thomas stopped looking at me the same way. Ethan's voice seemed to matter more. My father believed him, or at least he wanted to. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of the spiral. I reached for it and saw the name flash on the screen. Rachel Moore. I answered immediately. "Liv, are you home?" "Yes," I said. "Just got back." I heard her exhale softly. "Meet me at Donovan's in 30 minutes. Donovan's was a small cafe near the Brooklyn Promenade. Rachel always picked it when she wanted privacy. I didn't ask questions. When I arrived, Rachel was already sitting in a corner booth, her leather jacket draped over the seat beside her. She had a cup of coffee in her hand, and that look on her face, the one she got when she was onto something big. "You look like hell," she said as I slid into the booth. "It has been a day," I replied flatly. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I heard something you need to know." I watched her carefully. Rachel was a journalist and she had a network of sources that reached places I could never go. "Before he died, your father was planning to change his will." I froze. "What?" She nodded. "One of my contacts in the legal circuit said Thomas Carter had been in talks with a different attorney in late September. He wanted to draft a new document. Something about making things right." I felt my pulse quicken, but she continued, "He didn't get the chance. 2 days before his meeting, he collapsed." My mind raced. If that was true, then the will Marcus read wasn't the whole story. "Do you know why he wanted to change it?" Rachel hesitated. "I'm still digging, but it lines up with some chatter I heard about Ethan. There were whispers he was moving money around covering his tracks." I leaned back against the booth. The room felt suddenly smaller. So he knew. My father knew. "It looks that way." I rubbed my temples. The memories from 2018 swirled with the present. Ethan stealing money from the project, my father blaming me, Marcus, caught in the crossfire. And now, even after all that, Ethan was the one who walked away with everything. Rachel reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on mine. "Liv, you cannot just let this go." I looked at her, my voice quiet but firm. "I won't." She nodded once. "I will keep pulling threads. There is more here, I can feel it." We sat in silence for a moment, the clinking of coffee cups and soft hum of conversation filling the air around us. I stared at the dark liquid in my cup, feeling the pieces start to shift in my mind. Thomas had wanted to change the will. Ethan had reasons to stop him. And Marcus? Marcus was holding something back. I straightened slowly, feeling a calm determination settle over me. This wasn't over, not even close. Rachel watched me carefully. "What are you going to do?" I met her gaze. "I am going to find out exactly what Ethan did." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that said she was in. "Then let's start." Outside, the drizzle had turned back into snow. I stepped out of the cafe with Rachel beside me, the cold air sharp against my face. The city lights blurred in the falling snow, but for the first time in weeks, my thoughts felt clear. There were answers out there. I just had to find them. The next morning, I called Henry Dawson's office. His assistant sounded hesitant when she heard my name, but finally agreed to slot me in for a quick meeting. I knew Henry had been my father's closest business partner, almost like a second in command at Carter and Sons, and if anyone knew the truth behind the company's current mess, it would be him. His office was in a sleek high-rise in Midtown Manhattan, all glass walls and spotless white marble floors. When I stepped inside, the atmosphere was as cold and polished as the decor. Henry was standing near the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking down at the city like he was surveying a battlefield. "Olivia," he said as he turned toward me. His voice was polite but restrained, the kind of tone used when someone knows the conversation will not be pleasant. "Please sit." I lowered myself into the leather chair across from his desk. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He finally moved behind the desk, adjusting his cufflinks before leaning slightly forward. "You should not have come here," he said quietly. I ignored the warning. "I need answers, Henry. I know my father was planning to change his will. I know he found something out about Ethan before he died." His expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered briefly. "Olivia, some things are better left alone." "Better left alone?" My voice sharpened. "My brother stole from the company, framed me, and now he has everything. My father wanted to fix it. You know that." Henry exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. "This is not just about your brother." "What do you mean?" His jaw tightened. "There are larger forces involved. The board investors, even people outside the company. You don't understand how deep this goes. It's not just about money. It is about politics, about influence. If you push, you will bring attention from people you don't want to deal with." I leaned forward. "So, you are telling me Ethan is protected?" He didn't answer directly. He just said, "If you value your safety and your mother's, you will let this go." The words hung in the air like smoke. Before I could respond, the door opened. Ethan stepped in his presence, filling the room instantly. His eyes met mine, and that familiar smirk spread across his face. "Well, well, I should have guessed you would run to Henry." I stiffened. "What are you doing here?" He walked closer, adjusting his tie casually. "This is still my company, Olivia. I have every right to be here." Henry straightened in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden tension. "Ethan, this isn't a good time." Ethan ignored him. He looked at me, his tone dripping with mockery. "You just can't let it go, can you?" I stood, feeling heat rising in my chest. "I am not going to let you get away with what you did." He tilted his head slightly. "Get away with what, saving the company after you nearly ran it into the ground? That is a lie, and you know it." His smile widened. "You always were dramatic. No wonder Dad stopped trusting you." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to shout. Henry stepped in, his voice firm. "Enough, Ethan." But Ethan kept going, his words slicing into me. "You had your chance, Olivia. You failed. Dad saw that, everyone saw that. It is time you accept reality." I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I opened my mouth to fire back, but then I saw her. Victoria was standing just outside the doorway, half hidden behind the glass panel. She was watching us intently. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something that wasn't quite aligned with Ethan. She wasn't smiling. When she realized I saw her, she looked away almost too quickly. She stepped back into the hallway as if she hadn't been there at all. Ethan adjusted his jacket, clearly enjoying the scene. Run along now, Liv. You are wasting everyone's time. I didn't move. He leaned closer, his voice low. If you are smart, you will stop digging. I stared at him, letting the silence stretch. Then I turned to Henry. You could stop this, I said quietly. You know the truth. Henry looked pained, but said nothing. I walked out of the office without another word, my heels echoing down the hallway. As I stepped into the elevator, I glanced down the corridor. Victoria was still there, standing near the reception desk. She met my eyes for a brief moment, then looked away again. It was quick, but I saw it. She wasn't fully on Ethan's side. The elevator doors closed, and I exhaled shakily. By the time I got outside, my phone buzzed. I pulled it out of my coat pocket and saw a message from an unknown number. Do not trust what you saw today. My breath caught. I opened the message further and saw the name attached. Marcus. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. He was watching. He was still trying to reach me, even if it was from the shadows. The snow had started falling again, soft flakes landing on my hair and coat as I stood on the sidewalk. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, feeling the weight of everything pressing harder now. Whatever Marcus meant, I knew one thing. The truth was deeper than I thought, and I was closer to it than ever. The next morning, I took the first train out to the Hamptons. The Carter estate sat silent under a blanket of snow, the same winding driveway I had walked weeks ago, now lined with icy branches. I had avoided coming back since the funeral, but now I knew I had to. There was one person left in that house who had been with my family long enough to know things no one else would say out loud. Grace Miller had worked for the Carters for over 30 years. She had practically raised Ethan and me when my parents were too busy building their empire to notice the small things. If anyone had seen what was happening in the final days before my father died, it was her. I rang the side bell instead of walking through the grand front entrance. It felt wrong to enter like a guest. After a moment, the door opened, and Grace appeared bundled in a knitted cardigan, her silver hair pulled back into a low bun. Olivia, she said softly, her face warm but tired. I wondered if she had been expecting me. Hi, Grace. Can we talk? She studied me for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in. The inside of the house felt frozen in time. Everything was exactly how I remembered it as a child, but colder now, emptier. Grace led me to the small kitchen at the back, away from the formal dining rooms and polished halls. She poured tea into 2 mugs and set one in front of me. You look just like your father did when he was your age, she said quietly. Determined, restless. I hesitated. Grace, I need to ask you something. She nodded slowly, waiting. The night before he died, was my father himself. Did he seem worried? Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't name. She sat down across from me, her fingers wrapping around her mug. He was not himself, Olivia. He was troubled. I had never seen him that way before. Troubled about what? Grace hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. He asked me to bring him the study keys that evening. Said he needed to call Marcus Reynolds. He told me he had finally seen the truth about Ethan. My breath caught. What truth? She looked down at her tea. He said Ethan was moving money from the company, that he had proof. He told me he could not allow Ethan to inherit everything. I gripped the edge of the table. So he was going to change the will. Yes. He told me Marcus would help draft the new documents. He planned to meet with Marcus the following week, but he died before that meeting. Grace nodded silently. I swallowed hard, feeling anger and sadness mix into something sharp in my chest. Grace stood, walked over to the pantry, and pulled out a small locked box. She set it on the table gently and unlocked it with a tiny brass key. Inside was an envelope yellowed slightly at the edges, with my father's handwriting on the front. My name. He gave this to me the night before, she said softly. He told me if anything happened, I was to make sure you saw it. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before finally sliding it open. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper with his signature at the bottom. The handwriting was rushed, but clear. Olivia, trust Marcus. He will know what to do. Do not let Ethan fool you. My throat tightened. I read the words again and again, feeling something crack open inside me. He knew. He wanted to fix it. Grace touched my hand gently. Your father was not blind, Olivia. He loved you. He realized too late the mistake he made. I looked up at her, blinking away the sting in my eyes. Why didn't you give this to me sooner? She hesitated. I was afraid. After he passed, Ethan came here, asked questions. He told me to keep quiet about everything. I thought maybe it was better to stay out of it, but I see now I cannot. I folded the note carefully and slid it back into the envelope, gripping it tightly in my hand. Grace, thank you. She gave me a sad smile. Be careful, Olivia. This is bigger than just a family fight. I nodded, standing. I could feel the weight of the envelope in my pocket like a spark of truth I'd been waiting for. As I walked toward the front door, I glanced down the long hallway lined with portraits of my family. My father's stern face stared back at me from one of the frames. I paused for a moment, letting myself remember him the way he was before all of this, demanding yes, but still a man I believed would always protect me. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a wave. I pulled my coat tighter and made my way back toward the station. On the train ride back, I pulled out my phone and stared at the message Marcus had sent me the day before. Do not trust what you saw today. Now it made sense. He had been trying to tell me something without saying it outright. He was still holding on to the truth, maybe waiting for me to find it. I opened my contacts and scrolled to his name, my thumb hovering over the call button. But I didn't press it yet. Not until I was sure of my next move. The city skyline came into view as the train approached Manhattan. I slipped the envelope back into my bag, feeling a strange mix of clarity and dread. Marcus was the key. He always had been. And now I knew for certain he wasn't the enemy I thought he was. I booked a last-minute flight to Seattle the following morning. Marcus had been avoiding phone calls, and I knew he wouldn't respond to emails. If I wanted answers, I had to look him in the eye. The rain was steady when I landed, a soft gray drizzle that clung to the streets and made the city feel muted. I texted him once more, keeping it simple. We need to talk. No more running. Meet me. He responded 30 minutes later with an address. A small cafe near Pike Place Market, the kind of place you could disappear into without anyone noticing. When I walked in, the smell of roasted coffee and baked bread hit me instantly. Marcus was already there, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall. He was in a navy wool coat, his hair slightly damp from the rain, his hands wrapped around a mug. For a moment I just stood there, taking in the sight of him. It had been years since we'd sat face to face without the weight of rumors or accusations between us. He looked up, his expression guarded but not hostile. Olivia, he said softly. I slid into the seat across from him. We sat in silence for a few seconds, the noise of the cafe filling the space between us. Finally, I spoke. I went to see Grace. His fingers tightened slightly on his mug. She gave me a note. From my father. He wanted to change the will. He told me to trust you. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, exhaling slowly. I was afraid you would find that. I leaned forward. Tell me everything. He stared at the table for a long moment before meeting my eyes. Thomas called me the night before he died. He told me he had discovered Ethan was funneling money from the company through shell accounts. He said he could not leave him in charge. He wanted me to draft a new will immediately. So why didn't you? I did, Marcus said quietly. I had the new will prepared and ready to sign. But before Thomas could execute it, he collapsed. I felt my chest tighten. So there is a new will? Yes. But it is not valid without his signature. It holds no legal weight. I sat back, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. He had tried, but it wasn't enough. Marcus looked away for a moment, his jaw tense. After the funeral, I thought about revealing what Thomas told me. But then William Hayes came to see me. Victoria's father. Marcus nodded slowly. He told me if I even hinted that there was another will, my career would be destroyed. He made it very clear he had the connections to make that happen. I swallowed hard. So you stayed quiet. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I thought I could protect you by staying silent. I thought if I kept my distance, you would be safer. I shook my head, trying to process it all. Marcus leaned closer, his tone sharper now. Olivia, you need to understand. Ethan and Victoria are not just a couple. Their engagement is part of a deal. What kind of deal? He hesitated, then continued. Ethan promised William Hayes access to Carter and Sons construction contracts for his political allies. In return, William would use his influence to secure major government projects for Ethan's startup and keep any legal scrutiny away. It is an exchange of power, not love. I felt my stomach twist. So Victoria is just a piece of the bargain. Marcus nodded grimly. She is playing her part to secure her father's agenda. I sat in silence, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he was telling me. My brother hadn't just stolen money. He had sold the company's integrity for his own gain. And William Hayes was pulling the strings behind the scenes. Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He slid it across the table toward me. What is this? Inside you will find names. People who handled the transfers. Accountants, junior executives, assistants. All of them were paid to keep quiet. I stared at the envelope but didn't pick it up yet. These people can testify, Marcus continued, but they will not come forward on their own. They are afraid of Ethan and William. I finally reached for the envelope, feeling the weight of it in my hand. Why are you giving me this now? Because I cannot keep pretending I do not see what is happening, he said quietly. Your father wanted to make this right. I failed him once. I will not fail you. I met his eyes. For the first time in years, I didn't see the man I thought had betrayed me. I saw the man who had once stayed up all night combing through project files to help me prove my innocence. You could lose everything, I said softly. Marcus smiled faintly, a sad kind of smile. I already lost the one thing that mattered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the cafe faded into the background. I slipped the envelope into my bag, feeling a surge of determination. What do I do with this start digging? Quietly. Build a case. Marcus leaned back slightly. And Olivia, be careful. William is not someone you want to cross without a plan. I nodded slowly. As I stood to leave, Marcus reached out and touched my hand lightly. Olivia, whatever you think about the past, I never used you. I cared about you. I still do. I didn't know what to say, so I just held his gaze for a moment before pulling my hand back gently. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, letting thin streams of light cut through the gray. I tightened my coat around me and started walking the envelope in my bag, feeling heavier than its size should allow. The next step was clear. I needed to find the people on that list. I needed to make them talk. The invitation arrived 2 days later, an ivory card with gold lettering sealed in wax. Ethan and Victoria's engagement party at the Langford Hotel in New York City. It was exactly the kind of place my family used to frequent when appearances mattered more than anything else. I turned the card over in my hand, wondering if he had sent it to gloat or simply to remind me where I stood. Rachel was the one who convinced me to go. You have to show your face, she said over the phone. He expects you to stay away. That is exactly why you need to be there. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. The Langford's ballroom was dripping in excess. Crystal chandeliers cast soft gold light over marble floors. Waiters moved gracefully between guests, holding trays of champagne. The city's elite filled the room, their conversations alone hung with calculated politeness. I stepped through the doors alone, wearing a simple black dress that felt understated among the sequins and jewels. Heads turned as I entered. I could feel the eyes on me, the whispers barely contained. There she is? Someone murmured. Near the center of the room, Ethan stood with Victoria on his arm. He was laughing at something one of the board members said, his teeth bright under the lights. Victoria wore a champagne-colored gown that shimmered as she moved. When she spotted me, her smile flickered for a fraction of a second before returning. Ethan followed her gaze, and the smirk that crossed his face told me everything I needed to know. Well, look who decided to show up, he said loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. I walked toward them slowly, keeping my head high. You didn't think I would miss the performance, did you? I said, quietly. His smirk deepened. Careful, Liv. This isn't the kind of place for outbursts. These people are here to celebrate. Celebrate what exactly, I asked. Before he could answer, a woman in a glittering red dress stepped in to congratulate Victoria. And the moment passed. Ethan turned back to his admirers, already dismissing me. I stepped aside, trying to disappear into the edge of the room. That's when I felt a soft touch on my arm. Victoria. She stood close enough that no one else could hear. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, her voice smooth but not unfriendly. I looked at her carefully. Why not? Because this room isn't meant for truth. It is meant for illusion. Her words hung there, strange and deliberate. I narrowed my eyes. What are you talking about? She tilted her head slightly, her lips curving in a faint smile. Sometimes what someone holds isn't really theirs to keep. I stared at her, but she offered nothing more. She turned gracefully and slipped back toward Ethan, leaving me with more questions than before. Across the room, I spotted Rachel. She was dressed simply, blending into the crowd, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched. She caught my eye and gave me the faintest nod. She was already working. I moved closer to her, weaving between the clusters of guests. "Anything yet?" I whispered. She didn't look at me directly, just sipped her drink. "He's here, the accountant." I followed her gaze to a man standing awkwardly near the back of the room. I recognized him immediately from Marcus's list. Simon Kerr, one of the junior accountants who had been involved in covering Ethan's tracks. Before I could process it, Ethan walked toward Simon, his hand casually in his pocket. He handed him something discreetly, a white envelope folded in half. Simon took it quickly, stuffing it into his jacket. Their exchange was brief, but it was enough. Rachel's camera phone was already angled perfectly. She captured the moment in silence. I watched Victoria during the exchange. She was standing nearby talking to another guest, but I could see her eyes. She noticed. She saw exactly what Ethan was doing. For a brief second, her polished mask cracked. Rachel slipped her phone into her clutch and gave me a small nod. "Got it." I exhaled slowly, my mind racing. A waiter passed by and I grabbed a glass of champagne just to have something in my hand. My fingers were trembling. Across the room, Simon moved quickly toward the exit, glancing around nervously. Ethan stayed behind unfazed, continuing to charm the guests as if nothing had happened. I turned to Rachel. "We need to talk to Simon." She shook her head slightly. "Not here. Too many eyes." I looked back toward Victoria. She was watching me now. Our gazes locked for a moment, and I could see it, she knew. She knew what Ethan had done, but she wasn't stopping him. Not yet. The music shifted to a softer melody. Ethan took Victoria's hand and led her to the center of the room. The crowd gathered around them as they made a small speech about love, family, and the future. I stood at the edge of it all, my stomach churning as I watched them put on their show. Rachel leaned in close. "We have what we need for now, but this is just one piece." I nodded, unable to take my eyes off Victoria. Her smile was flawless, but it didn't reach her eyes. She glanced at me once more just for a second, and in that flicker, I saw something unexpected. Doubt. The applause started around us as Ethan kissed her hand for the cameras. I felt the envelope from Marcus heavy in my bag, the photo Rachel had just taken hidden in her clutch, and Victoria's gaze still burning into me from across the room. Something was shifting, I could feel it. Rachel called me the next morning before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. Her voice was sharp with urgency, but steady in that way she got when she knew she had something real. "I found him," she said. "Simon Kerr. He used to manage Carter & Son's secondary development accounts. He is the one Ethan used to move the money." I straightened, gripping the phone tighter. "And he has copies of the transfers, screenshots, invoices, everything." Rachel's voice lowered. "He kept them as insurance in case Ethan turned on him. Where is he now, hiding? He knows Ethan is watching him, but he agreed to talk only if you can guarantee he has protection." I hesitated for a moment. "I can do that. I will find a way." After hanging up, I immediately called Marcus. We met that afternoon in a quiet cafe in downtown Manhattan, away from the eyes of anyone who might recognize us. He was already there, sitting with his laptop open, his tie loosened like he had been working for hours. So Marcus said Rachel has the accountant. Yes, Simon has proof, but he is scared. He won't come forward without protection. Marcus leaned back slightly. He is right to be scared. Ethan and William have deep pockets and longer arms than you think. If Simon talks, they will come after him. That's why we need someone who can make this airtight, I replied. Someone outside their circle. Marcus's eyes darkened with thought. There is one person, Samuel Grant. Who is he? A financial attorney, independent, no ties to Ethan or William. He used to handle whistleblower cases for corporate fraud. If anyone can structure this the right way, it is him. Can you set it up? Marcus nodded. I will reach out. But Olivia, you have to understand. If we go to Samuel, this moves past family drama. This becomes a war. I didn't blink. Then it's already a war. Later that evening, Rachel and I met Simon in a dimly lit cafe in Queens. He sat in the farthest corner, his posture tense, his eyes darting to the door every few minutes. When I approached, he looked at me like he wasn't sure he should even be there. Olivia Carter, he said quietly. I never thought I would meet you. I sat down slowly. Simon, I need to know exactly what Ethan did. He glanced around before pulling out a small flash drive. It's all here. The transfers, the dummy accounts, even the payments to the staff who kept quiet. Why are you helping me? Because I am done being afraid, he said, his voice shaking. Ethan promised me safety, then started cutting me out. I know what happens to people who stop being useful to him. Rachel reached over and put her hand on his. You are doing the right thing. I took the drive and slipped it into my bag. Simon looked at me with tired eyes. You have to move fast. He knows I'm nervous. We will, I assured him. 2 days later, Marcus called. Samuel Grant has agreed to meet. When I walked into Samuel's office, it felt different from every other lawyer's office I had seen. There were no flashy displays, no luxury furniture. It was practical, clean, and filled with stacks of files labeled in neat handwriting. Samuel himself was in his mid-40s, sharp-eyed, but calm. Marcus introduced us briefly before Samuel got straight to the point. Marcus says you have evidence. I handed him the flash drive. He plugged it in and scanned the files, his brow furrowing slightly as he clicked through the documents. This is substantial, he said finally. But it will not be easy. Ethan will claim these are fabricated, and William Hayes has enough influence to bury any weak testimony. We will need at least 2 more witnesses to corroborate this. I nodded slowly. Marcus slid another envelope toward him. Names, Marcus said. People who were paid to stay quiet. Samuel studied the list carefully. I will start reaching out. But Olivia, once we begin this process, there is no turning back. I met his gaze without hesitation. I know. That night, as I sat in my apartment going over every detail in my head, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I answered, and the voice on the other end was soft. Careful. Olivia. It is Victoria. I froze. What do you want? There was a pause, then she spoke again, quieter this time. We need to meet, alone, before the wedding. Why? Because I have something. Something Ethan is terrified of anyone seeing. I felt my pulse quicken. What is it? Another pause. I cannot say over the phone, but if you want to bring him down, you will need it. When and where, I will send you the details tomorrow. And Olivia, be careful who you trust. The line went dead. I sat there staring at my phone, my heart pounding. Victoria Hayes was reaching out to me. She was playing a dangerous game, and I had no idea which side she truly stood on. Rachel called shortly after. She sounded breathless. I looked closer at the photo I took at the engagement party. Olivia. Victoria saw Ethan pay off Simon. She saw everything. I closed my eyes for a moment, processing it all. Victoria wasn't an ally, but she wasn't blindly loyal either. She was caught between her father Ethan and whatever secret she was holding. She was the piece that could tip this entire thing over. The message came in the middle of the night. A single text from a blocked number, with only an address and a time. It was a small wine bar tucked away in Napa Valley, far from the noise of New York. I booked a flight that morning and didn't tell anyone except Rachel where I was going. The bar was quiet when I arrived, its dim golden lights reflecting off rows of bottles behind the counter. It smelled faintly of oak and something sweet, like crushed grapes. I spotted Victoria immediately. She was seated in the back corner dressed in a simple beige coat, her hair pulled back loosely. Nothing like the polished figure she was at the engagement party. When she saw me, she gestured for me to sit. Her expression was calm, but there was a tightness in her posture that gave her away. "Olivia," she said softly, "thank you for coming." I studied her carefully. I did not have much of a choice. "You said you have something Ethan is afraid of." She looked down for a moment, almost like she was rehearsing her words. "You need to understand, I am not here out of loyalty to you. I am here because my father put me in a position I never wanted." I waited silently. Victoria sighed. "My engagement to Ethan is not about love. It is a transaction. My father needed funding for his political campaign. Ethan needed William Hayes's influence to shield his financial mess. So they made a deal. I was the deal." Her voice wavered slightly, but she straightened her shoulders quickly. "So, you are helping him steal everything my father built," I said quietly. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine. "Not exactly. I did not know the full extent until after it started. And now it is too late for me to walk away without ruining myself." I narrowed my eyes. "Then why call me?" She reached into her bag and placed a manila envelope on the table between us. "Because there are things even Ethan does not know I have." I hesitated, then slowly pulled the envelope toward me. Inside was a single folded document. I unfolded it carefully, and my breath caught. It was a copy of a will. My father's handwriting was unmistakable. It was dated just 2 days before he died. "This is real," I whispered. Victoria nodded. "Marcus sent it to my father as leverage. William never told Ethan it existed. He wanted to hold it in case Ethan ever stepped out of line." I stared at the document, feeling my hands tremble. My name was there, clear as day. My father had reinstated me as his primary heir. "Why are you giving this to me?" Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because I am not the enemy you think I am. I am trapped, Olivia. I cannot ruin my father's career, but I also cannot let Ethan win completely. This is my way of leveling the board." I narrowed my eyes. "What do you want in return?" She didn't hesitate. "If you go public with this, you will bring all of us down, including me. I need your word that you will not expose my past or my involvement in this arrangement." I studied her, trying to read what she wasn't saying. "What are you hiding?" Her gaze hardened. "Things that do not concern you. Things that could destroy me." We sat in silence for a moment. I glanced back at the will, the signature glaring back at me like a lifeline I had been desperate for. I closed the document slowly and slid it back into the envelope. "Fine. I will keep your secret. For now." Victoria exhaled, some tension leaving her body. "Good. Then listen carefully. Ethan is suspicious of you. He knows you are digging." My pulse quickened. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "He plans to make sure you never make it to the wedding." I stiffened. "What does that mean?" "He has people watching you. If you try to show up at the ceremony, they will stop you before you even get near the venue." I felt a chill run through me. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you need to be smarter than him. If you want to bring him down, you cannot play his game directly." I swallowed hard. "And you? Where will you be when this happens?" Her eyes softened for just a second. "On the stage, pretending to be the perfect bride." She stood gathering her bag. "One more thing, Olivia. Ethan may think he controls everyone, but even he has blind spots. Use them. Before I could respond, she was gone. I sat there for a long time staring at the envelope in front of me. My father's will. Proof that everything Ethan had done was built on lies. But Victoria's warning echoed in my head. He was preparing for me. He was one step ahead, and I would have to be careful. When I returned to my hotel, I called Marcus immediately. He answered on the first ring. I have it, I said quietly. A copy of the real will. There was silence on the other end before he finally spoke. Then we have leverage. But Olivia, you need to be careful. Ethan will not play fair. I know. I hung up and stared out the window at the rolling vineyards of Napa Valley under the setting sun. The wedding was only weeks away. Ethan was tightening his grip, but now I had something he didn't know I held. The game had changed again. Napa Valley glimmered under the early summer sun, the vineyards stretching endlessly under a pale blue sky. The Langford estate had been transformed into a palace of glass and white roses, with golden arches framing the massive outdoor venue. The wedding was everywhere in the press, already being called the social event of the year. $2 million poured into one perfect day designed to showcase power. I arrived quietly, dressed in a simple navy dress and dark sunglasses. My invitation wasn't official. I had Marcus to thank for that. He had slipped my name into the guest list through one of his discreet contacts. Still, the moment I stepped past the front gates, I felt eyes on me. Security guards in black suits stood at every entrance. I recognized one of them instantly. Ethan's men. I kept moving. Blend in. Breathe. The plan was clear. I wasn't here to cause a scene, not yet. The crowd was a mix of polished political figures, high-profile CEOs, and perfectly manicured influencers. Laughter floated through the air like champagne bubbles. Cameramen moved discreetly along the edges, taking photos for the media. It all felt staged like a movie set. I spotted Linda near the edge of the garden terrace. My mother looked pale, thinner than I remembered, in an elegant pastel dress that seemed to hang off her frame. Her hands clutched a clutch bag too tightly. When her eyes found mine, she froze. "Olivia," she whispered as I stepped closer. "What are you doing here?" I wanted to smile but couldn't. I needed to be here. Her lips trembled slightly. "You don't understand how dangerous this is. Ethan, he knows you've been digging." I touched her arm gently. "Mom, I'm fine. Just trust me." Before she could answer, a shadow fell over us. I turned and saw one of Ethan's guards standing a few feet away, talking quietly into his earpiece. He glanced at me, once his face unreadable. Linda stiffened. "He told them you might try something." I swallowed the rising tension and forced myself to stay calm. I scanned the crowd and found Marcus near the champagne fountain. He caught my eye and gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible. He was here. He was ready. Then I saw Ethan. He stood at the center of the garden, surrounded by reporters and sycophants, his tailored white suit catching the sunlight. His smile was the same carefully crafted one he always wore in public. Beside him, Victoria was a vision in her lace gown, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her face flawless for the cameras. For a brief second, Victoria's gaze flicked toward me. She didn't falter, but I saw just a hint of tension in her eyes. I stepped back into the crowd, moving toward the tented reception area. I needed to stay close enough to act, but not close enough to get noticed by security too early. Marcus met me halfway. "Two of his men are watching you," he murmured quietly. "They've been circling since you arrived. We have to move carefully." "Is everything in place?" I asked. "Yes. Rachel has the media lined up outside. Samuel has all the documents ready to release the moment you give the word. Ethan doesn't know we've locked the witnesses in with protection." I nodded, my breath coming shallow. It was all set. The wedding procession began with soft music violins echoing through the estate. Guests slowly moved to the main garden where a crystal platform had been set for the ceremony. I slipped into the back rows, keeping low. As Ethan and Victoria walked to the altar, photographers snapped frantically. Ethan paused mid-step to scan the crowd. His eyes swept over me. For a second I thought he saw me, but he turned away, smiling again for the cameras. Linda was seated in the front row, her shoulders stiff. She looked like she wanted to scream, but couldn't. I kept my hands folded in my lap, watching as the officiant began the rehearsed words. The perfect facade was unfolding, and yet every detail felt fragile, like it could shatter with a single wrong breath. Then my phone buzzed. I pulled it from my bag and glanced down. It was a message from Samuel Grant. All evidence compiled. Witnesses ready. Press waiting outside. When you give the signal, we go public. I stared at the screen, feeling my heartbeat in my ears. Marcus slipped into the seat beside me. It's time, Olivia. But once we do this, there's no undoing it. I looked back toward the altar. Ethan was holding Victoria's hands now, pretending to be the man he'd never been. He had no idea what was about to hit him. The officiant's voice carried through the crowd. Today, we gather to celebrate a union built on love, trust, and a shared future. The hypocrisy was almost suffocating. I tightened my grip on the phone. This was it. Everything was in place. One signal and Samuel would drop the truth like a bomb on the pristine image Ethan had built. I glanced toward Marcus. He gave me a small, steady nod. The violin music swelled. Guests leaned in smiling, waiting for the vows, and I breathed in slowly, ready to bring it all down. The officiant paused for the traditional moment before inviting anyone who wished to speak. The music softened, the guests leaned in, waiting for sentimental words about love and family. That was my cue. I stood up from the back row, my heels clicking against the polished platform as I stepped into the center aisle. Heads turned slowly, a wave of whispers following me. I could see Ethan's expression freeze for half a second before he forced his signature smile back into place. I climbed the small set of stairs leading to the stage, the white roses and glass arches framing me in perfect symmetry. The officiant looked confused, glancing toward Ethan for permission. Ethan didn't say a word, but his jaw tightened. I turned to the crowd, my voice calm but steady, carrying over the murmurs. I know I wasn't expected to speak today, but before this ceremony continues, there are truths that cannot remain hidden any longer. The garden fell silent. All you could hear was the faint hum of the breeze. I looked straight at Ethan, his perfect facade beginning to crack. You see before you a man celebrated for his charm, his success, his ability to inherit an empire. But what you don't see is how he stole that empire, how he siphoned millions from Carter and Sons, how he paid off staff to keep quiet, and how he framed me, his sister, to cover his tracks. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras swung toward me. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering to each other. I held up a sleek black folder and opened it with deliberate precision. Inside were copies of the fraudulent transactions, the witness statements. Samuel had prepared the bank records, showing Ethan's name on every transfer. These are the financial records of Ethan Carter. Funds diverted through shell companies and fake accounts. Money laundered, hidden, and used to buy silence. The first flashes from reporters went off like sparks. And it doesn't end there. I continued, my tone sharper now. Ethan is not just a thief, he is a pawn. His marriage to Victoria Hayes is not a union of love, but a transaction between two powerful families. William Hayes funds his political ambitions by trading his daughter to secure Carter and Sons contracts. In return, Ethan hands over control of projects worth millions. Victoria gasped dramatically, one hand flying to her chest. Her acting was flawless, but her eyes flickered, revealing the cold calculation behind her mask. The crowd erupted into chaos. Guests shouted questions. The officiant stepped back, clearly shaken. Reporters at the edge of the ceremony rushed forward, cameras flashing wildly now. Ethan finally moved, stepping toward me, his face pale but furious. His voice was low and venomous. "Stop this right now, Olivia." I didn't even glance at him. I reached into my bag and pulled out the final piece. A single sheet of paper in my father's handwriting. And here is the last truth. My father, Thomas Carter, discovered Ethan's fraud. He drafted a new will to disinherit him. But before it could be signed and filed, he died. And this man buried my father's wishes, along with his name. I held up the document high enough for the cameras to catch it. This is the real will, dated 2 days before his death. naming me as the rightful heir. For a moment, everything froze. Ethan's face went rigid. His hand clenched at his side, his breath coming in sharp bursts. He knew. He knew it was over. From the side of the crowd, Marcus stepped forward. He walked calmly to the stage, his presence steady. He faced the guests and the media, his voice clear. "I am Marcus Reynolds, the attorney who prepared this document at Thomas Carter's request. I can confirm its authenticity and validity under New York law." The reaction was instant. Chaos rippled through the crowd. Some guests shouted, others backed away from Ethan as if he were contagious. The press was relentless now, shouting questions over each other. "Is this true? Did you steal from the company? How long have you been working with William Hayes?" Ethan turned to Marcus, his face twisted with rage. "You think you can do this? You think they'll believe you?" Marcus didn't flinch. "They already do." Victoria stood frozen in place, her expression a perfect mask of shock for the cameras. She reached for Ethan's arm gently, like a supportive fiancé caught in a scandal she didn't understand. But when her eyes met mine for the briefest moment, I saw it. The glint of quiet satisfaction. She was already slipping out of the wreckage. Ethan tried to speak to defend himself, but the crowd drowned him out. Reporters shoved microphones toward him. Security looked lost, unsure who to follow, unsure how to contain the scene unraveling in front of them. I turned toward my mother. Linda sat in the front row, her face pale and wet with tears. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and pride, her hands trembling in her lap. It was done. Ethan staggered back a step, his composure finally breaking. For the first time, I saw the truth in his eyes. He was cornered. The music that had been playing faintly in the background stopped altogether. The officiant quietly stepped off the stage. Victoria tilted her head, touching her forehead lightly, like she might faint. Guests rushed to her side, pulling her away from Ethan. She was no longer his shield. She was free of him now, perfectly untarnished. The estate was no longer a wedding. It was a battlefield. I stood at the center of it, calm in the storm, and watched my brother's empire crumble. The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, news outlets across the country had picked up the story. Headlines screamed about the Carter wedding scandal, financial fraud, and the political connections that crumbled in a single night. Ethan was escorted out of the Langford estate by authorities before the sun even rose. His white suit wrinkled his face ashen. He didn't resist. He knew there was nowhere left to run. Within days, federal investigators froze every account he controlled. The hidden shell companies, the offshore funds, the quiet payoffs, everything was laid bare. Carter and Sons was removed from his authority, and the board voted unanimously to reinstate the leadership Thomas had originally intended. What was once Ethan's gleaming empire turned into a hollow shell, dismantled piece by piece under the public eye. William Hayes tried to deny his involvement, but emails, contracts, and witness testimony told a different story. The political donors who once backed him vanished overnight, and his name became synonymous with corruption. Within a week, his campaign offices closed, his ambitions erased as quickly as they had risen. Victoria disappeared from the media storm entirely. She gave a carefully scripted statement to the press, expressing shock and heartbreak before retreating from public view. A month later, I heard she had quietly started her own consulting firm in San Francisco, far from the chaos she had so carefully escaped. She was untouched, just as she planned. My mother called me not long after the investigation began. Her voice was soft, tired, lined with regret. "I need you to know something, Olivia," she said. "I knew Ethan was hiding things. Not everything, but enough. William threatened me. He told me if I spoke, he would destroy what was left of this family. I thought staying silent would protect you." I closed my eyes and listened. For so long, I had believed she had chosen to betray me. But hearing the fear in her voice now, I realized she was just as trapped as I had been. It hurt, but I told her the only thing I could. "I forgive you, Mom." When the courts validated my father's final will, everything shifted. My name was cleared. The shares, the properties, the accounts, everything Ethan had stolen was returned to me. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming what he had tried to erase: my father's faith in me, my own dignity, my voice. I didn't keep it all for myself. I founded the Thomas Carter Foundation, dedicated to mentoring and funding young architects from underserved communities. It felt like the right way to honor the man my father was, in his final days, the man who tried to make things right, even when it was almost too late. Marcus stayed by my side through it all. One evening, as we walked through the nearly empty offices of Carter and Sons, he stopped and looked at me with a weight in his eyes I hadn't seen before. "I am sorry, Olivia, for every moment I let you believe I betrayed you. I was scared I was cornered, but I never stopped caring about you. I never stopped loving you." I didn't answer right away. I just let the words settle soft and heavy. And then I smiled a small, quiet smile that felt like the first real one in years. Life didn't return to what it was before. It became something new. I went back to architecture on my own terms. I designed projects that carried meaning, that built more than buildings. My name wasn't just tied to scandal anymore, it was tied to redemption. Months later, I found myself standing in front of the Hamptons estate. The late afternoon sun stretched long golden rays across the lawn. The house that had once been the center of so much pain now looked almost peaceful. I walked slowly to the edge of the gardens, the breeze warm against my face. I thought about my father, about how much was lost before the truth came to light, and how much strength it took to finally uncover it. Justice had come not in the way I imagined, but in the way it needed to. I whispered softly, more to myself than anyone else. Justice may come late, but it never truly disappears. The truth cannot be buried forever. And to anyone who has been betrayed by the people you thought you could trust most, remember this. No matter how deep the lies go, no matter how heavy the darkness feels, the truth always finds its way to the light. If you've ever carried a story like mine, share it. Stay with us. You are not alone, and your truth matters.